Well, a couple months ago, we all watched the news and special programming regarding the 20th anniversary of the events that took place on 9/11. We remember, of course, probably exactly where we were. If you were old enough to remember that event, you probably remember exactly where you were when the events of 9/11 took place. It was shocking for us all, and as those events developed and we realized it was more than just an accident, that it was indeed a terrorist attack, it became even more significant and sobering, I think, to all of us. We heard stories of firefighters racing up the stairs of the World Trade Center, knowing that they probably would not be coming back down, knowing they were risking their lives to do what they could to save other lives. We heard stories of the passengers who charged the cockpit of Flight 98, who caused that plane to crash so that it would not go on to do damage to another building. Acts of self-sacrifice, and what we term today heroism. I think we look at these people as truly heroes that inspired a nation. We've had over the years in our country other heroes as well, people who have earned the respect of many over the decades of American history. Now some of those individuals inspire controversy. And there are debates as to whether we should continue to have their statues in various places, or whether we should bring them down, move them, or even destroy them, because they did not share some of the values that we have today. And so the idea of heroism is debated today. Who should be our heroes? Who shouldn't be our heroes? Who should we emulate? Who should we not emulate? There is that ongoing debate. I found an article recently written by Adam Kirsch. He is an American poet and literary critic. He is on the seminar faculty of Columbia University's Center of American Studies. And he has a few things to say that I felt was very interesting regarding heroism. He wrote in this article, he said, one of America's proudest contributions to the modern world is a new kind of democratic heroism, in which the firefighters can be greater than princes, and glory and power matter less than moral courage and sacrifice. He makes the comment that oftentimes throughout history, those who have been deemed heroes have been among the aristocracy, those who were rich, wealthy, who did amazing things. One example that he gave was the Red Baron in World War II. In Germany, he was considered a hero because of the number of kills he had. And throughout much of history, even ancient history, ancient Greece, the heroes were those who were the strongest, the most capable in warfare, those who were able to kill the most number of the enemy. But in America, it's oftentimes been different. He notes the World War I hero, one of the World War I heroes, named Sergeant Alvin York. There was a movie made about this particular young man. He led a small group of gunmen to take a German machine gun nest that took 132 prisoners captive. It was an act of bravery, of courage. This Sergeant Alvin York, what made him so special in America's eyes was he was a regular guy from Tennessee, just a regular guy. And it kind of inspired a nation that anybody, any American could become a hero or be somebody that was admired simply for doing the right thing at the right time. Anybody could be a hero. Kirsch goes on to write that what is distinctively American is the idea that you don't have to look like a hero to be a hero. And he gives the example of Abraham Lincoln. He said he was born in backwoods poverty, entirely self-educated, even mocked among Easterners for his lack of polish. He emerged at the critical moment when one man capable of ending the Civil War and saving the Union stood up and did so. It seemed like he was almost tailored for that position. He was uniquely qualified, even though many mocked him. He just didn't look like a hero. But he ended up being a very admired American hero. General George Washington. When you compare him to many of the famous generals throughout history, he wasn't that brilliant of a general, not really. But he was there at the right time, and he was self-sacrificing. In fact, he followed the example of Cincinnatus in the Roman Empire, the Roman Republic, where he gave up his position when they offered him to be the king of this new nation. Washington turned it down. And it was the act of self-sacrifice that made him such a heroic figure in American society. When other nations throughout history, it would have been the act of taking that kingship that made you great. In America, it was that act of self-sacrifice. The late Senator John McCain, you remember him, he was considered a war hero, not for his strength, not for his kills, not for his fighting skills, but he was captured in the war in Vietnam in October 1967. And he suffered torture in solitary confinement at the infamous Hanoi Hilton. It was interesting that in 1968, a year later, his father was named the commander of the American forces in Vietnam. And the Vietnamese offered to let John McCain go because of this, as a gesture of good faith. But he refused to go. He would not be set free when there were captives that had been taken captive long before him that were still being held. He would not be set free until those who'd been captured before him were freed. What a noble act. He is remembered because of this noble action while a prisoner of war. What nation does that? It was that act of self-sacrifice that made him a hero in Americans' eyes. And it's very different, as this author, as Kirsch points out. We look to self-sacrifice. We look to doing the right thing in the right circumstance, being an example that others can admire and that others can emulate, inspiring others to do the right thing. These are the kind of things that make for an American hero. And I just thought that was a very interesting article, and to point those things out, because American heroism, according to him, is very different than historic heroism. And I think it's an important thing for us to consider. Who are your heroes? Who are your heroes? Who inspires you? Who do you wish to emulate? Who motivates you to do the right thing when times are difficult? Who inspires you to do what's most important in life? We oftentimes have people that we look to as heroes. They may not consider them that. We may not even use the term hero. But there are people in our lives, perhaps it's our mother or our father, another relative, a close friend, a fellow church member, that we've looked to over the years, and they've inspired us. They've given us a kind of motivation to continue on. Of course, not in a way that takes anything away from God, but in a way almost that you can consider that God uses them to help motivate others. Let's go back to Hebrews chapter 10. Today I'd like to talk about what we have termed the heroes of faith. The heroes of faith. Now we find that list in Hebrews chapter 11, but I want to pick up the context in Hebrews chapter 10, because I think picking up the context of what's being talked about in chapter 11 is very important. There's a reason that the author of Hebrews, we've oftentimes will refer to Paul as writing it. That is sometimes contested, but certainly could very well have been Paul. But he puts in context this list of heroes. Now, there are other ancient texts that list heroes. And they list heroes, and oftentimes they will list who they are. Even in Jewish history, they'll list who they are and the different qualities that made them heroic or made them admirable. This list in Hebrews 11 is very different because it focuses on one thing. Every one of them are said to be people of faith. Not someone who was strong, not someone over here who was resourceful, someone over here who was faithful, and then a person who was faithful in some way. They all have that same common quality, faith. And that makes it rather unique in literary history. But let's pick up the context in verse 23 of Hebrews chapter 10. It says, "Let us hold fast the confession of our hope without wavering." Here is the context. How can we continue on the confession of our faith, continue on faithfully without wavering? How can we do that? It's a good question for us today. As we sit here today, not knowing what our future holds, at least the details of our future, we just are hearing news of a new variant of the virus. And we thought, oh no, not again. What's life going to be like? Are we not going to get back to some kind of normalcy? Is there going to be a whole other set of fears that come upon the world? Are we going to shut down again? I mean, all these questions that we don't have answers to. But we must go forward without wavering. How can we do that? It goes on to say, for he who promised is faithful. Notice that. God is faithful. God has made a promise and he is faithful. Will we be faithful? Verse 24, and let us consider one another in order to stir up love and good works. This is something that we read often in the context of coming to services, because it goes on to say, not forsaking the assembling of ourselves together, as is the manner of some, but exhorting one another. It puts it in context of that we need each other. We need to be exhorting, encouraging, stirring up one another. The subject of a whole nother sermon is how can we do that when we do come to services? But this is part of the reason we're here, is to exhort one another, to stir one another. And certainly when someone is not here or someone stops attending, it's discouraging in a way to see that. Perhaps a person doesn't intend that to be the case, but it oftentimes is the case. It can become rather discouraging. Just the fact that we are coming together helps stir us in that way. It says, but exhorting one another, and so much more as you see the day approaching. Wow, as things get tougher and tougher, and the world looks dimmer and bleaker and more sinful, more discouraging, we're going to need all the more to come together, to be there to stir one another to love and good works, so that we can hold fast. So that we can hold fast without wavering. So that is the context here. And it goes on to say in verse 26 and 27, 28, it continues on, it says, if we sin willfully after receiving a knowledge of the truth, there's no longer remains a sacrifice of sins. In other words, if we fall away, there's a penalty. God does not like that. God is our judge, and he talks about the fiery judgment that will come upon those who willfully turn. And so we don't want to fall into that category of people. We want to endure. We want to remain faithful. And so he warns us all the way through verse 31 about this penalty that is received by those who do not remain faithful. And he goes on in verse 32 and 33 to talk about, it says, you endured a great struggle with sufferings. And certainly our forefathers have in the church. And many of the Jews who became Christians endured a great deal of persecution because they turned from Judaism to Christianity. And that wasn't favorable in so many eyes. They endured hardships. It even says in verse 34, the plundering of their goods, their very possessions taken from them. Verse 35, therefore do not cast away your confidence, which has great reward. Notice, even though what they had experienced so much suffering and so much turmoil in their lives because of their decision to become a Christian, he says, do not turn away from your confidence, which has great reward. We're going to see that theme too, that there is a reward for those who remain faithful to God. Verse 36, for you have need of endurance, so that after you have done the will of God, you may receive the promise. So this is the context of Hebrews chapter 11. These heroes of faith is the idea that we need endurance. We need to be able to endure to the end. Verse 38 says, now the just shall live by faith. If anyone draws back, my soul has no pleasure in him. But we are not of those who draw back to perdition, but of those who believe to the saving of the soul. We are among those who continue. We sit here today among those who continue in the faith. And now he's going to go back into history and look at some of those who lived by the same faith that we do. The same faith that we do. Notice, picking up in verse 1 of Hebrews chapter 11. And let me, as we get into this, let me read it first. Now faith is the substance of things hoped for, and the evidence of things not seen. For by it the elders obtained a good testimony. By faith we understand that the worlds were framed by the word of God, so that the things which are seen were not made of things that are visible. Now, I don't intend in this sermon today to get into the concept of what is faith and how do we expand our faith in a theological sense. I do intend to talk about how much these heroes of the faith mean to us. what we can learn from their individual stories. That's what I'd like to focus on today. We could focus at another time on the definition of faith. He's not really giving a formal definition of faith here so much as he's giving some of the characteristics we see in people who have faith. And sometimes that can be very inspiring to us, to see faith in action, rather than just think about what it means in a theoretical sense, to see what it means in real life. And that's where he's going with this. Notice in verse 4, by faith, Abel offered to God a more excellent sacrifice than Cain, through which he obtained witness that he was righteous, God testifying of his gifts. Now, notice that. We think about the story of Abel, Cain and Abel, and we know that both brought an offering. Cain brought an offering of the fruit of the field. Abel brought an offering of a blood offering, something that could be sacrificed. And we really don't know for sure what made Abel's better. We don't know for sure. The implication seems to be because it was an offering of a sacrifice of an animal rather than just the field. Now, having said that, God does accept sacrifice. He does accept offerings from the field. We see that as we go further into Leviticus and Deuteronomy. But evidently, perhaps this is one that God expected to be a blood sacrifice. One that, as we might imagine, might look forward to the very sacrifice of Jesus Christ. We know, and when God gave the sacrificial system to Israel, that those blood sacrifices pointed to Jesus Christ. Now, they didn't see that at the time. They didn't have that theological understanding. We don't exactly know how much God revealed fully to Moses at that time. But we do know that that sacrifice pointed to something that was more important in the future. It was significant. And they did it. Even though they didn't understand fully why, they still did it. It was their way to obey God, and God had a purpose in it. Abel obeyed God. It says that he was righteous. So in some way, he did what was right, whereas Cain did something that wasn't quite up to par. Notice it says, and though it is being dead, still speaks. That is the idea of Abel here. Even though he's dead, his example speaks. Now think about it. Abel was killed. It's not like God protected him because he did the right thing. Cain killed his brother. What a brutal thing. What a terrible thing. What a thing to have happen when Abel did the right thing. He still suffered because of it. But you see that sacrifice, that willingness to do the right thing, even though he, in the end, died for it, it speaks to us today. Now, it's not implying that Abel's still alive, but that faith speaks to us. The idea of believing and doing the right thing, even when others around us might not, that speaks to us today. What about verse 5? Enoch. Enoch was taken away so that he did not see death, and was not found because God had taken him. And before he was taken, he had this testimony that he pleased God. And without faith it is impossible to please God, for he who comes to God must believe that he is, and that he is a rewarder of those who diligently seek him. Let's break that down a little bit. First, let's focus on Enoch. We're not told a whole lot about him, except that he was righteous. And evidently, God took him away from a very dire situation. And the word in Hebrews, he transferred him. So he went from one place where evidently he was in danger of being killed, and God literally saved him from that death so that he would not see death. And so we understand that God took him somewhere else so that he wouldn't be put to death. Now, that didn't happen with Abel. But because of Enoch's righteousness, God preserved his physical life, took him out of that danger that he was in. And sometimes this happens. We've all, I think most of us have experienced miracles where something preserved us, kept us from being hurt or injured or even killed. Sometimes that does happen. And the example of Enoch continuing in righteousness, even though there were those who were against him, as there always will be those who are preachers of righteousness. Notice, though, that even though we're not told in Genesis a whole lot about Enoch, notice what the author of Hebrews says. Without faith, it is impossible to please him. Enoch pleased God, and Paul is making the point here that without faith, we can't please God. It's impossible. It's not something that we should have, that would be nice if we had it. It's something that we absolutely must have. We must have faith. It says, for he who comes to God must believe that he is. You must believe that God exists, but is that enough? James tells us even the demons believe that God exists. But notice it goes on to say we must believe that he is, and that he is a rewarder of those who diligently seek him. In other words, we must believe that God exists, but we also must believe this aspect of God's character, that he will reward. There is a reward for those who diligently seek him. And as we're going to see as we go through the remainder of this chapter, it is looking to that reward that is so helpful, that is so vital. We must have faith that God not only exists, but he will reward each and every one of us for our diligence, that we can endure because there is that reward. Now let's continue on with some of these examples. Verse 7 says, by faith, Noah, being divinely warned of things not yet seen, moved with godly fear, prepared an ark for the saving of his household, by which he condemned the world and became heir of the righteous, which is according to faith. Now let's just take a moment here and pause and imagine what it must have been like for Noah. I know if someone reminded me after I spoke about this in Huntsville, they were reminded of the Bill Cosby skit, Noah. You've probably heard that. But imagine being in Noah's shoes, and God speaks to you. He warns you that there's going to be a worldwide flood. Build an ark. Really? I mean, this has never happened before. He probably could have imagined, well, am I just hearing things? Is this really God? Why would I build this massive ark? And how are we going to get all these animals here? This just is too much to ask. I mean, you can think of it humanly. Imagine being in Noah's shoes. Imagine being this preacher of righteousness, as Peter calls him, and you're building this ark and the people are mocking you, as I'm sure they did, because who builds an ark like that when there's no ocean anywhere around? It was a tremendous act of faith to simply believe that God was going to do what he said he was going to do. And he put his family on display, and I'm sure, as I said, mocked in every way, because it probably just simply looked like he was out of his mind. He had to endure that. But he believed. He built that ark. And it's interesting, too, to think that God could have just saved Noah and his family, have them hover above the water. But no, Noah had to build something. He had to put his own blood, sweat, and toil into it. He had to build this massive ark that took years and years and years. God showed him what to do. He told him how to do it. But he still had to show his faith by his works. Again, it's not that God didn't have the power to just save him from the flood, but God expected him to do something, to show his faith. And Noah did that. You think about that. Imagine being in a place where no one else believes you. Everyone thinks you're stupid. Everybody thinks you're out of your mind. But you continue for years and years and years because you know that God told you to do it. It's God's will for you. That is endurance, isn't it? And he was looking to something more because he believed there would be a flood. He knew that this would be the means by which God provided them salvation, physical salvation through the flood. And he acted in faith. What an example that is for us. I think it's helpful for us sometimes not just to read the Scripture, but to put ourselves in their place. Would we have that kind of faith? How can we have that kind of faith? What an amazing man Noah was to have that kind of faith. And how much can we desire to emulate that hero of faith? It's not that Noah was perfect. We know that he wasn't. But in this particular case, he showed a tremendous amount of faith and is an example for us. Notice verse 8. We have the introduction of Abraham. And he spends quite a bit of time on Abraham here. He says, by faith, Abraham obeyed when he was called to go out to the place which he would receive as an inheritance. And he went out not knowing where he was going. Now think about that. Abraham's doing quite well, as by all evidence we have in Scripture. He was quite wealthy, quite well off. And God just simply tells him to leave his homeland. Go, I'm not going to tell you where, it ends up he tells him that he shows him the homeland that he will eventually inherit, even quite a while after he's already there. He didn't even know initially that was his homeland. But you're asked to go somewhere and you don't even know where you're going. God, I'll go, but tell me where first. I mean, I got to know where. You know, it makes sense. It's reasonable. Just tell me where. And the implication here in the actual Greek is that Abraham went right away. When God told him to go, the implication of the grammar indicates that there wasn't any waiting. It was as soon as one commentator puts it, while the words were still ringing in Abraham's ear, he left. He didn't even know where he was going. Now that is faith. That is the faith that God is going to provide, even though I don't have the answers. I don't know how this is going to work out. I don't know how I'm going to provide. I don't know where it is. God will give it. He'll show it to me when we get there. I know He will fulfill His promise. That is faith. It's the same faith we need to have when we know that God's kingdom is coming, when we know that Jesus Christ is going to return, when we don't know what all we're going to have to go through, but we know that's coming. And we're willing to step out in faith and continue on, just as Abraham did. Notice verse 9. By faith he dwelt in the land of promise as in a foreign country, dwelling in tents with Isaac and Jacob, the heirs of him of the same promise. This is a significant point. Think about it. He went to the land that God told him he was going to inherit, but he never inherited any of it. The only land he ever owned in that area was what he bought to bury Sarah. He lived in tents. Yet he all that while believed this would someday be his land. This was the land God is going to give me and my children. Could you continue in that kind of faith at age 100 when God still had not acted to give it to you? When there still was no indication anything was being done to give you that land? When you could go to God and say, God, I'm still living in this tent. Why can't you give me land so I can at least build a house? You know, the way we think humanly. Yet he believed. Father of the faithful. There was never any physical evidence that he was getting a thing. But he knew it was going to happen because God promised it to him. In fact, Genesis chapter 13, verse 15, I won't turn there, but it's the place where God says, I will give you and your descendants. Yet he died never having seen it. Some would believe he's in heaven right now and will perhaps always be in heaven. But the reality is God is going to give Abraham that land. Abraham's going to be resurrected. And he knew he would be. And evidently he had an awareness that it would be a very good resurrection. We don't know how much he knew about spiritual life and all that, those details. But we do have evidence here that he knew there was a better life after death. And that he would inherit that land. God promised it. And he never got it during his days. He lived in tents. Notice verse 10. For he waited for a city which has foundations, whose builder and maker is God. He had some concept of the kingdom. Now, again, we don't know how detailed, but some concept of the kingdom. Perhaps the New Jerusalem that would one day come. Again, we don't know all the details, but we know the gospel was preached to him. At least some aspect of it. He looked to the reward. And he didn't grumble about the fact that he still was living in a tent. He had faith. Notice verse 11. By faith, Sarah herself also received strength to conceive seed. And she bore a child when she was past the age, because she judged him faithful who had promised. Now think back to that story. You all know the story of Sarah and God making the promise back in Genesis chapter 18. God met with the one who became Jesus Christ, met with Abraham. He said, he made the promise that he would have a child. You remember Sarah was standing behind the door, kind of listening in. And remember what she did? She laughed. She laughed. The idea that I, at my age, and Abraham, look at Abraham. Could he ever father a child at his age? Ha, ha, ha. You know, and that's reasonable human thinking. But it says in Genesis chapter 18 that, she was past the age of childbearing, and she laughed within herself. Within herself, notice, it wasn't some boisterous laugh that the guests could hear. She laughed within herself. And the Lord said to Abraham, "Why did Sarah laugh? Shall I surely bear a child since I am old?" Saying, "Shall I surely bear a child since I am old? Is anything too hard for the Lord?" Now, we know from the story that Sarah said in verse 15, I didn't laugh. She's scared about what's going to happen. She laughed within herself. But this guest, God knows that she laughed. I think that very moment was the beginning of a transformation, because we look back at Sarah's story. We don't see someone who was full of faith. We don't see someone who burst into the room saying, "Thank you, God, I believe I'm going to have a child because you just promised it. I believe." We see someone laughing in herself at the physical impossibility of it. But then she was called out. And I think that may have been the start of a realization that, hey, I am limiting God. How did he know I had that thought? Maybe he truly can do everything. Because evidently, from the story here, we find that Sarah became a person of faith. We see the example that she wasn't initially. And that gives hope for us. Because sometimes we don't have the faith that we need. Sometimes we can sense it in ourselves that we just can't see this happening. God doesn't toss us away. Sometimes he can do that, which helps us come to understand that nothing is impossible to God. God can indeed do it. And I believe that Sarah is mentioned so prominently here, not because of her initial reaction, but because of what she came to believe. She came, in Genesis 21, it talks about her rejoicing and her kind of making fun of herself for laughing. After Isaac was born, she said, "God has made me laugh, and all who hear will laugh with me." She kind of pokes fun at herself a little bit for that initial response. But she saw that God indeed was faithful. So that's a tremendous example for us, that even though sometimes we may not have the faith we think we need, we can develop it. God can develop it in us. We simply believe that God will do what he says he will do. That's what all of these people did. Noah did, and others. Let's go on in verse 12 then. "Therefore from one man, and him as good as dead, were born as many as the stars of the sky in multitude, innumerable as the sand which is by the seashore. These all died in faith, not having received the promises." They died in faith. No promise had been given yet. It had only been made. There was no evidence, no physical evidence the promise would ever be fulfilled except for the son that was born. But inheriting the land, there was no evidence yet. They died in faith, not having received the promise, but having seen them afar off. They were assured of them, embraced them, confessed that they were strangers and pilgrims in the earth. For those who say such things declare plainly that they seek a homeland. This is an amazing verse to consider, verse 13 here. How they were assured of them, embraced them, confessed. They knew that though they were pilgrims and strangers in the land at that time, that would be theirs. And it's as if they had no doubt. They simply knew. Now, in saying that, I don't mean to imply there might not have been periods or moments of doubt. They were human just as we are. But ultimately, they simply believed. So much so that they continued to pass down that blessing. Let's continue on in verse 15, though. Truly, if they had called to mind the country from which they had come out, they would have had opportunity to return. That's almost a challenge for us. If we call to mind the benefits of living in the world, of being part of the world, we could talk ourselves into returning. But they look to something else, something in the future, a greater reward. It says in verse 16, "But now they desire a better, that is a heavenly country. Therefore God is not ashamed to be called their God, for he has prepared a city for them." Now, of course, this isn't saying that they believed they were going to heaven, but a spiritual, heavenly country in terms of a spiritual existence, being changed to spirit. And as we know from Revelation, the kingdom of God descending upon this earth, Jesus Christ reigning, his spiritual Of course, he was resurrected, spiritual being. He's going to be spiritual and reigning as God on this earth, and spiritual beings, the saints, reigning with him, it says in Jerusalem. And ultimately, in Revelation 21, a new Jerusalem coming down from heaven. They look to the future. Verse 17, by faith, Abraham, when he was tested, offered Isaac. And he who received the promises offered up his only begotten son, in whom it was said, in Isaac your seed shall be called. Now, who could do this? This ultimate act of faith, this ultimate test in Abraham was, yes, I've given you this son. You're seeing him grow. He is the one that I'm going to give you blessings of a multitude of descendants. Now go sacrifice him. I mean, humanly, what would we think of something like that? What if we were Abraham? What if we had seen this miracle take place of having a child in our old age? And for several years, some years now, raising him, knowing he's a fulfillment of God's promise. And then God says, go sacrifice him. Would our minds be swirling? What? Why? How is this going to work? It seems, though, that Abraham simply knew that God would have the answer. Things don't always go the way we think. Things don't always go the way we hope. We just simply sometimes have to be faithful, accept that in faith God knows what he's doing. And I'll play this out the way God says, and I'll rely on him. Notice it says, verse 19, Abraham concluded that God was able to raise him up even from the dead, from which he also received him in a figurative sense. In other words, God brought him into existence the first time via a miracle. What's to stop God from bringing him back to life? In other words, Abraham simply believed God had the power to fulfill his promise. Whatever road he had to take to get to that, God could fulfill it. And he simply put his faith in God. These are real life examples of faith. These aren't definitions. This is not faith in theory. It's faith lived in real life, in all the different circumstances that all these people lived through. Notice it says in verse 20, by faith Isaac blessed Jacob and Esau concerning things to come. By faith Jacob, when he was dying, blessed each of the sons of Joseph while leaning upon the top of his staff. And by faith Joseph, when he was dying, made mention of the departure of children of Israel, and gave instruction concerning his body. Think of it. Generation after generation after generation, there was no inheritance. They had no land. It had gotten to the point where Joseph was in Egypt and Jacob was in Egypt. They were dying. Yet they blessed their children. They blessed these firstborn. They blessed them with the promise. They put that promise upon them because they knew it was going to be fulfilled. I don't know if those of our generation today that, we have such the, satisfy my needs now, fix the problem now. We're very impatient as a people, it seems, compared to so many generations past. Could we really wait this long without losing our faith? I don't know. I question that in myself. But you know what? I'm inspired by these people. I'm inspired by these heroes. Even though maybe I don't know that I could do the same thing, their story motivates me. It gives me a sense of, hey, if they can do it, I can do it. And maybe it inspires us all. I think that's one of the big reasons that's written the heroes of faith. It's not termed heroes in the Bible, but again, as we see them, they are those who inspire us to continue in the same faith that they had. In fact, it mentions by faith Joseph, made mention of what to do with his bones. He believed that Israel was going to go back. Where did they go? Into slavery. He believed that they were going to go to the promised land that God had made to Abraham generations before. Where did they go? They were being harmed. They were enslaved. They had no ability to decide anything about their faith. They were completely in the hands of the Egyptians. They couldn't make it happen if they wanted it to happen. God was going to fulfill the promise in a way that only God could be given the glory. But the way we think of it, let's make this make sense to us. Let's have some progress toward the fulfillment. Nope, God was going to have them go backwards and backwards and backwards, descend into slavery, and then ultimately do great miracles to bring them out of Egypt and into the promised land. And the tremendous spiritual analogy that we learn from and talk about oftentimes at Passover season, it's an amazing story. It's an amazing example for us. Notice, though, in verse 23, by faith Moses, when he was born, was hidden 3 months by his parents, because they saw that he was a beautiful child, and they were not afraid of the king's command. Of course, we know that all the children were supposed to be put to death. Something, it says by faith Moses, and you get the implication here, that Moses' parents believed something special about Moses. We're not told what it was. Maybe they saw an opportunity for this childless princess in Egypt to have a child. He was so beautiful that surely if they floated him in front of her, somehow she saw him and wanted to rescue him, that she would certainly take him in. I don't know, but that's what happened. That's what they did. And of course, he grew up accepted by Pharaoh's daughter. He grew up a prince of Egypt. Perhaps his parents recognized an opportunity that Moses could be someone that could deliver. We're not told. But perhaps they were simply inspired by God. This baby's different. I've got a purpose for him. And they believed it. Verse 24, by faith Moses, when he became of age, refused to be called the son of Pharaoh's daughter. Now, as many commentators will point out, this is a technical term. Son of Pharaoh's daughter is a technical term for the heir of the throne, the next Pharaoh. Now, who among us would choose, if we could be the next Pharaoh, this powerful and wealthy Egypt? And we have been preserved some of the things that made this society in Egypt, some of the amazing tombs and the riches they have, so that I think we can understand what Moses was giving up. The ancient history of Egypt did not just disappear. We know much of it, and we know what Moses was giving up. But in verse 25, he says, choosing rather to suffer affliction with the people of God than to enjoy the passing pleasures of sin. Wow. Moses gave up being Pharaoh, perhaps. All the wealth, the power, the prestige. Prestige and power and wealth that we can't even imagine. But sometimes we're tempted by a job that offers half again more. Sometimes we're tempted by whatever it is that we're tempted by in this life that doesn't even come close to what Moses gave up. What an inspiration. And if Moses could give up that much, why can't I give up that little bit? Sometimes I'm tempted. Perhaps sometimes we're tempted to go back. But no, look at the example of the faith of Moses. Notice it says he esteemed, in verse 26, the reproach of Christ greater riches than the treasures of Egypt. By example, we would esteem being persecuted, being made fun of, because we believe what we do. We would esteem that as greater than all the riches of the world around us. Why did he do that? It says he looked to the reward, verse 26. That looking to the reward is powerful. When we know that God is a God who rewards those who diligently seek Him, when we truly believe that about God's character, and that when we truly believe that that reward is beyond anything we can imagine, and when we see stories like this of Moses giving up so much, it inspires us, doesn't it? It can be inspiring for us to look to the reward, even though we give up so much less than Moses did. If he can do that, we can do it. What a sermon Moses preached, even though he didn't say a word here. He just did the right thing. Verse 27, by faith he forsook Egypt, not fearing the wrath of the king, for he endured as seeing him who is invisible. By faith he kept the Passover, the sprinkling of the blood, lest he who destroys the firstborn should touch them. Think about the faith it took for the Israelites to as a slave people to believe that that blood on the door would actually protect them. And hearing the cries of the Egyptians, and knowing what was going on, how much fear there could be, but they believed that putting that blood on that doorpost would stop it. And they did it, because otherwise it would just be, well, I'm not going to do that silly thing. Why would I put the blood of a lamb on the doorpost? How's that really going to help anything? We got real problems here. We need to form up a defense. You think about what things might go through their mind. But they simply put the blood up, and that saved them. Of course, we recognize that was symbolic of the blood of Christ. God had a plan the whole time. God had a plan in Abraham's time. And he revealed to Abraham some of the details of it, that they would inherit it later. They had to wait in patience and have faith. Notice verse 29. By faith they passed through the Red Sea as by dry land, whereas the Egyptians attempted to do so were drowned. Can you imagine seeing that Red Sea open? It would be an amazing sight. That Red Sea opens up. But you're going to tell me to go into that thing? To have the walls of water on both sides of me? Now that's a whole different kind of faith. I like the sight of it. I'm amazed by the miraculous nature of this, but I ain't going in there. It took an amazing faith to step down into those waters, walled up on both sides. And of course, they saw the great miracle of it when the Egyptians were drowned by it. It could have been them, but God saved them by a marvelous miracle. And of course, we know that symbolized baptism. They were symbolically baptized through that Red Sea, under the water. All this had spiritual significance that they didn't even know about. God was waiting to reveal that later. In His great plan, everything was worked out. Notice in verse 30, by faith the walls of Jericho fell down after they were encircled for 7 days. Now, who takes a city by marching around 7 times and shouting? Nobody. It's never been done in history. But God made it happen. And they had faith that what they were asked to do would work. And so they did it. By faith, the harlot Rahab did not perish with those who did not believe when she had received the spies with peace. She could have been put to death for receiving the spies and hiding them the way she did. But it was an act of faith. She believed the stories that she had heard about the God of Israel. And she wanted to be a believer in the God of Israel. And this is an amazing story because it shows that even a harlot, even a sinner, can become a believer and be accepted by God, and even her name put in the midst of the heroes of faith. Perhaps it's the whole reason is because of the change that even a Gentile who was a harlot can be forgiven and accepted into Israel, not just into Israel, but named among the heroes of faith. We can too. Any one of us can be a hero of faith. Now, I don't mean to say that any of us are Abraham or Rahab or anything like that, but all of us have our story. And each of us has a story that can inspire others. Anyone can be a hero of faith when God's Spirit is working in us and we're yielded to that, and we are truly faithful. And he goes on to say, what more can I say? For the time would fail me to tell of Gideon and Barak and Samson and all this other list of names. He goes on to say, who stopped the mouth of lions in the end of verse 33, Daniel in the lion's den, who quenched the violence of fire that perhaps Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. All these stories of faith, and they're not all, in other words, he's saying there's so many more I could tell. There's so many more I could tell, but this is a split sermon, so I've got to end it somewhere here real quick. But notice it says, just to conclude this, it talks about women who received their dead raised to life again. Zarephath and the Shunammite woman who received their children resurrected again. It says that they might obtain a better resurrection. Notice at the end of verse 35. Evidently, there was some knowledge of a resurrection, a life after this physical life, that they knew was coming. A better resurrection. Just going on down here, I'm not going to read through all of this, but it does say, it talks about in the end of verse 37, some were stoned, sawn in two. By tradition, Isaiah was sawn in two by the wicked King Manasseh. It says, wandering in sheepskins and goat skins, being destitute, afflicted, tormented, of whom the world was not worthy. I have preached sermons at funerals, and I've used that phrase, of whom the world was not worthy. Faithful people who died in the faith, some having suffered a great deal, but they remained faithful all the way to the end. They did not receive the promise. Perhaps they were praying to be healed. They didn't receive that ultimate healing yet. They will. And they knew it. They know it. We know it. And they knew it. And they remained faithful. Even when it seemed the prayers weren't being answered, they were faithful. And I think we've all experienced friends who've died in the faith who we just admire that they became all the more faithful the worse things got. How does that work? But it did, and it does. And they inspire us too. This is a list of individuals here in Hebrews chapter 11 that is very important. They are examples of faith. Verse 40 says that God, having provided something better for us, that they should not be made perfect apart from us. They're not in heaven. They haven't been made perfect already. We're going to be made perfect together, we're told here. We're going to be resurrected and be able to see Abraham, see Rahab. We're going to be able to have conversations with them. Perhaps tell Moses how his story inspired us. He has no idea how all this turned out. He has no idea what was coming from his time to the end time. We have a lot to talk about. But we can tell him how what he did inspired us to give up the world around us and to seek the kingdom. Let's conclude in Hebrews chapter 12, where it says, verse 1, therefore we also, since we are surrounded by so great a cloud of witnesses, let us lay aside every weight and the sin that so easily ensnares us, and let us run with endurance the race that is set before us. Looking to Jesus. We didn't even list him among the heroes of faith here, but what greater example do we have of faithfulness, of sinlessness, of suffering for others? Looking to Jesus, the author and finisher of our faith. He is the one who began it. He is the one that will finish it. He will work with it. He will work with us. We can ask him for faith to develop that faith that he has. He is the author and finisher of our faith, who for the joy that was set before him endured the cross, despising the shame, and is set down at the right hand of the throne of God. Notice he was able to endure everything that he went through. If you consider the torture and everything that he went through as he was scourged, as he was mocked, it says he endured that for the joy that was set before him. He knew what it would be like to be on the other side of the pain, on the other side of the suffering. He knew what it would be like to have provided the perfect sacrifice for you and for me. He knew the joy of bringing into his family those of humanity that would ultimately lead to him. And it was that joy of that life in the future that allowed him to go through everything he went through, that indeed allowed him to live a sinless life. Brethren, I hope that these examples, these heroes of faith, and just talking about them and thinking about what they went through in reality, I hope that they are an inspiration to us. And I do hope that it inspires us in our lives to remain faithful, because our lives will in turn be an example to others. We may never consider ourselves a hero, but there will be a few who do, if we are faithful. There will be a few who look to us and say, thank you for the example you set. Thank you for inspiring me. And that's, brethren, one of the important reasons that we gather, that we're here, that we fellowship, that we are involved in one another's lives, so that we can indeed endure until the end.